The deadbolt clicked into place with a heavy, metallic finality that echoed down the narrow hallway. Alisha leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. She gripped the edge of the frame, her knuckles white, listening to the silence of the Seoul apartment. It was a stark, absolute quiet, a sharp contrast to the sirens and shouting she had left behind across the ocean. She gave the handle a firm tug, testing the latch, then did it again, ensuring the barrier held. She had brought Maya here to disappear into this stillness, to trade the chaos of her old life for the predictability of a new one. She pushed away from the door and turned toward the center of the living room, her eyes scanning the dim space. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering through the window. Everything was precisely where it should be. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the frantic rhythm of her heart to match the stillness of the room. But the silence felt heavy, pressing against her ears until it sounded almost like a low, persistent hum. She walked across the hardwood, her footsteps muffled by the lack of furniture. The apartment felt too spacious, too hollow. She moved into the kitchen, opening a cabinet to organize the few plates she had unpacked. But the sound of ceramic against wood rang out like a gunshot in the stillness. She stopped, hands suspended in the air, waiting for a response that never came. The silence here had a texture. It was thick, sitting in the corners of the ceiling and pooling under the tables like stagnant water. She walked to the window and looked down at the street, but the city below was muffled, as if she were viewing it from beneath a thick layer of glass. Returning to the living room, she sat on the floor, listening. The hum she had felt earlier had not vanished. It had evolved into a rhythmic, steady vibration that seemed to pulse through the floorboards. She pressed her palm against the wood, searching for a mechanical cause, but felt nothing but the building's own cold foundation. This was not the peace of a new beginning. It was the forced, unnatural stillness of a place waiting for something to happen. Alisha moved into the bedroom, her footsteps silent on the floor. She found Maya tucked deep under the covers, her breathing steady and soft in the dark. Alisha stood by the bedside, her eyes tracing the outline of her daughter's face, searching for any sign of the restlessness that had plagued them back home. She pulled the blanket up, tucking it firmly around Maya's shoulders, her touch lingering just long enough to confirm the girl was safe. A sudden, sharp draft brushed against her neck, cold as ice, originating from the corner of the room. Alisha straightened instantly, her eyes scanning the shadows near the window. The frame was locked tight. She stepped toward the glass, feeling the temperature drop further, a prickle of alarm raising the hair on her arms. She stood guard for a long moment, listening for the city outside, but there was only the hollow, rhythmic thrumming of the building. She returned to the bedside, pressing a hand to the wall as if to anchor herself against the growing chill. She would not let the past find them here. Whatever this house was, it would not take her daughter. She watched the door until her own eyes grew heavy, refusing to let her guard down for even a second. Tuesday morning arrived with a thin, gray light that failed to warm the kitchen. Alisha moved through the familiar motions of breakfast, the scraping of her spoon against the bowl sounding unnervingly loud in the morning stillness. She set a plate down, then pulled out 2 chairs. Maya climbed into her seat, but she did not reach for her juice. She did not look at her mother. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her small frame rigid, eyes locked onto the empty chair positioned directly to her left. Alisha paused, the milk carton hovering midair. She watched her daughter, waiting for the girl to reach for a toy or ask for toast. But Maya remained frozen in that singular, intense focus. The space beside the child was vacant, yet Maya turned her head slightly, as if following the movement of someone sitting there. Alisha cleared her throat, the sound sharp and brittle, but the girl did not blink. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, pressurized, as if the room were holding its breath. Alisha tried to smile, to break the mounting static of the moment, but the sight of her daughter staring so intently into nothingness made her hand tremble. She set the milk down, the plastic container hitting the counter with a dull, final thud. Alisha finally moved, her boots clicking against the tile as she closed the distance to the table. She poured a splash of milk into the bowl, the liquid swirling white against the ceramic. She looked at the chair Maya was watching, saw nothing but the morning sunlight hitting the floor, and felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. Maya leaned forward, her voice a thin, raspy thread that barely cut through the room's silence. "Uncle comes when you sleep, Mommy." The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Alisha let out a short, hollow laugh, the sound grating against her own ears. She reached out, her fingers tangling into the braids at the back of Maya's head, giving a gentle, rhythmic tug. "We don't have an uncle, honey. Just us and Daddy. You must have had a very long dream." She waited for the usual giggle, for the playful shrug that always followed a childhood story. It never came. Maya didn't smile. She didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty space beside her, her small jaw set in a line of absolute, terrifying conviction. A cold shiver crawled up Alicia's spine, turning her skin to ice even as the morning sun continued to pour through the glass. Alisha pulled her hand away as if the girl's hair were burning. She retreated to the sink, turning the faucet on full blast. The rush of water drowned out the silence, a chaotic white noise she desperately needed to fill the void. She grabbed a sponge and began scrubbing a clean plate, her movements frantic, repetitive, and hard. "Imagination," she whispered to herself. Just a vivid, active imagination. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window above the basin. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired. She told herself that children often fabricated visitors to cope with the stress of a cross-ocean move. It was a projection, nothing more. She turned off the water and wiped her hands on a towel, the fabric rough against her damp skin. She turned back to the table, determined to project calm. She forced a bright, artificial smile and began clearing the breakfast dishes. Maya remained in her seat, quiet as a statue, her gaze still anchored to that invisible point beside her. Alisha walked past her, deliberately avoiding the empty chair, but every nerve ending in her body felt the temperature drop as she crossed the room. The air felt thick, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand upright. She kept moving, refusing to look back, though the weight of that empty chair seemed to follow her every step. The sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, leaving the apartment in a deepening gray. Alisha moved through the rooms with a singular, frantic focus. She avoided the living room chair. She kept her eyes on the floorboards, counting them as she paced, trying to drown out the memory of the morning. Nightfall brought a different kind of pressure. She walked to the front door, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She gripped the handle, turning it until the latch groaned. She pulled it shut, then pushed it back against the frame. She inserted the key, turned it once, twice, 3 times. The deadbolt slid home with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed deep into the hollow hallway. She leaned her forehead against the cool, painted wood, closing her eyes. 1 click, 2 clicks, 3. The sound was supposed to be a barrier, a definitive line between the world she knew and the silence she feared. She stood there for a full minute, listening to the building settle, waiting for the house to stop breathing. She checked the lock one last time, her thumb tracing the cold steel of the bolt, confirming it held. She told herself that nothing could cross that line. She retreated to the bedroom, leaving the living room in total darkness. Dawn seeped through the window blinds, casting long, thin bars of gray across the bedroom floor. Alisha opened her eyes to a silence that felt heavier than the night before. She lay still, listening. No traffic from the streets below, no neighbors moving in the hall, only the sound of her own rhythmic breathing. She rose, her feet cold against the floor, and stepped into the living room. It was exactly as she had left it, yet the air felt thin, drained of warmth. She walked toward the entrance, her intuition sharpening with every step. She reached the door, intending to check the bolt, but her hand stopped midair. The brass handle was cold, but the resistance she expected from the locked deadbolt was missing. She pushed. The door swung inward with a soft, hollow creak that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was not shut. The heavy metal bolt, the one she had turned 3 times, was retracted. She stared at the gap, a sliver of the dark hallway visible beyond the threshold. The security she had built, the barrier she had meticulously reinforced, had been bypassed. A pulse of primal fear tightened her chest. making it hard to draw breath as she stood alone in the doorway, staring into the empty corridor. A sudden, sharp draft whipped through the gap, biting into the skin of her arms. It was not the stale, trapped air of the building hallway. It felt like a winter wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Alisha recoiled, her back hitting the doorframe. She looked down at the lock. The bolt remained fully retracted, as if it had been turned by a steady, deliberate hand from the outside. She pressed her palms against the door, trying to force it shut, but the wood felt heavy, resisting her effort with a strange, sluggish weight. She looked out into the corridor. The lights were flickering, humming with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the baseboards. Nothing moved in the shadows of the hall, yet the sense of presence was suffocating. She stepped back into the living room, but the cold followed her, swirling around her ankles. She realized then that the locks had not failed. They had been invited to open. The apartment no longer felt like a shelter. Every corner of the room seemed to stretch, the space between the walls expanding, making her feel small and exposed. She stood in the center of the living room, listening to the draft whistle through the crack, waiting for a footstep that never came. Alisha retreated from the living room, her movements stiff. She needed light, a distraction, anything to ground her in the mundane. She pivoted into the kitchen, reaching for the wall switch, but stopped. The room was already bathed in the pale blue light of early morning. Her gaze landed on the granite island. There, sitting perfectly centered on the dark stone surface, was a ceramic coffee mug. She stepped closer, her breath hitching in her throat. A thin, translucent ribbon of steam spiraled upward from the rim, dissipating into the cool air of the room. She knew that mug. It belonged to Min-jun. She reached out, her fingertips hovering just inches from the ceramic, and felt the radiating heat. It was fresh, boiling hot. The coffee had been poured only seconds ago. She whipped her head around, scanning the kitchen, the pantry, the narrow gap behind the refrigerator. Nothing. The apartment was silent, yet the presence of the warm drink suggested someone had been standing exactly where she was now. Mere moments before she entered, Min-jun was already gone, his office hours having started long before dawn, but the kitchen held the lingering, impossible evidence of his morning routine, now warped into a taunting domestic ghost. Alisha backed away from the kitchen counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed to find Maya. She turned and moved into the living room, her eyes darting across the familiar furniture. Everything looked exactly as she had left it the night before: the sofa, the rug, the lamp, until she reached the center of the room. Sitting on the coffee table was something that did not belong. It was a small wooden object, resting in the center of the dark surface. She walked toward it, her boots barely making a sound on the floor. It was a carving, no larger than a palm, shaped with jagged, intricate lines that seemed to twist even as she stared at them. She did not touch it yet. She leaned down, squinting in the dim light. The wood was dark, polished to a dull sheen, and smelled faintly of damp cedar. It had not been there when she tucked Maya in. It had not been there when she locked the door. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and brushed the surface of the carving. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in the freezer rather than the living room. It was a physical mark, a piece of evidence that someone or something had crossed the threshold while she slept. Alisha lifted the carving, the wood weightless and biting into her palm. She turned it over, the sharp edges digging into her skin. As she rotated the object, she noticed a sequence of deep, rhythmic notches carved into the base. They looked familiar. She moved to the side table where Maya kept her sketchpad and flipped through the pages. There, in a messy graphite smear, was the exact same pattern of notches. Her stomach dropped. This was not a random trinket left by a stranger. It was a response. A deliberate interaction with her daughter's imagination made manifest in the physical world. She looked back at the wooden shape, now seeing it not as a gift, but as a tether. Someone had been inside their sanctuary. Someone who knew exactly what Maya had been whispering about at the breakfast table. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. She gripped the carving so tightly her knuckles turned white, the polished surface slick with her sudden sweat. She wasn't just dealing with an intruder anymore. She was dealing with a presence that had bypassed every lock, every barrier, and every boundary she had worked so hard to build. Her protective instinct flared, sharp and jagged as the wood in her hand, as she scanned the empty room, suddenly certain that she was being watched. The sun dipped below the horizon, stripping the living room of its natural light. Alisha stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. She slipped the wooden carving into her pocket, the hard edge pressing against her thigh. She did not turn on the lamps. She waited in the gathering dark until the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock broke the silence. Min-jun stepped through the doorway. He did not call out. He did not switch on the overhead light. He moved through the foyer with a measured, rhythmic gait that felt rehearsed. Alisha stood in the kitchen doorway, her breath hitching as he passed the coffee table where the carving had sat only hours before. He didn't glance at it. He didn't pause. He walked straight to the bedroom, his movements fluid and detached. The house seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in with every muffled thud of his footsteps. Alisha tracked his shadow against the hallway floor. She had a dozen questions burning in her throat, but she forced them down. Confrontation required a moment of weakness, and right now, Min-jun was a stone wall. She stayed in the shadows, her hand hovering near the light switch, watching him disappear into the back of the house. The air felt thin, charged with the weight of things left unsaid. Alisha did not wait for the morning. She followed him into the bedroom, the wooden carving heavy and sharp in her palm. The room smelled of stale air and stillness. Min-jun stood by the desk, his back to her, arranging papers with a precision that bordered on obsession. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her pulse hammered against her throat. She pulled the carving from her pocket and slammed it onto the desk. The wood skidded across the surface, coming to a halt inches from his hand. Min-jun did not flinch. He did not even blink. Alisha stepped closer, planting her feet, refusing to yield the space. "I found this in the living room. Maya says someone is here when I sleep. I want to know who is leaving these things in our house." She watched his shoulders, waiting for a twitch, a breath, any sign of a reaction. Her eyes searched his face, desperate for a shred of logic or a simple denial. She needed a reason, something human to explain the impossible intrusion. Instead, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, turning the space between them into a void. She held his gaze, her jaw set, her hands curled into tight, white-knuckled fists, waiting for him to break the wall of indifference. Min-jun finally turned his head. His expression remained entirely flat, the muscles in his face slack, devoid of irritation or surprise. He did not look at the carving on the desk. He looked through it, and through Alisha, as if she were a ghost, of no consequence. "You are exhausted, Alisha," he said, his voice rhythmic and devoid of inflection. He turned back to the screen, his fingers finding the keyboard with a steady, mechanical tapping. "This move has been too much for you. You are seeing patterns in dust, hearing things in the settling of the floorboards." Alisha reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his shoulder, but she pulled back, as if burned by his absolute stillness. "The door was open, Min-jun. The carving is real." He didn't stop typing. He didn't even slow down. "You are imagining things," he repeated, the words landing like lead weights in the room. He leaned into the glow of the screen, his posture rigid and impenetrable. Alisha stood paralyzed by his refusal to engage. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing inward, isolating her in a reality he refused to acknowledge. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of his consistent, rhythmic typing drowned out her voice. The conversation was over before it had truly begun. Min-jun stopped typing. The sudden silence was sharper than the noise had been. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor. He stood, his movements fluid and entirely controlled, as if he were performing a pre-rehearsed sequence. Alisha moved to block his path, her hand outstretched, but he sidestepped her without a second glance. He did not look at her eyes, his focus fixed entirely on the bedroom threshold. He walked past her, his shoulder grazing hers, and the contact felt cold, like ice against skin. He reached the doorway and stepped across the threshold, his posture remaining perfectly upright. He turned then, not to face her, but to grip the handle of the door. His knuckles were white, the grip firm and final. Alisha watched his hand, paralyzed by the sudden certainty of what he was about to do. He pulled the door shut. The wood met the frame with a heavy, final thud that resonated through the hallway floor. Then came the sound, a metallic, biting click. The deadbolt slid home, anchoring the door into the frame. He was gone, the barrier established, leaving her standing in the sudden, hollow silence of the hallway, entirely shut out from his world. The echo of the deadbolt faded, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerator in the distance. Alisha stood motionless in the hallway, her palms still hovering where the wood had been. She reached out, fingers trembling, and wrapped them around the cold brass handle. She twisted. It did not budge. The mechanism held firm, a rigid rejection of her presence. She leaned her forehead against the door panel, the surface cool and unyielding against her skin. A sharp sting of isolation settled in her chest, heavy and suffocating. She looked down the length of the hall, at the shadows stretching across the floorboards. Everything here was familiar, yet everything felt alien. The photos on the wall, the rug beneath her feet, the very air she breathed, they belonged to a life she no longer recognized. She was standing in the center of her own home, yet she felt like an intruder watching a life that had been quietly dismantled. The silence was no longer empty. It was a weight. She pulled her hand back from the door, her movements slow and deliberate. She was alone, not just in the hallway, but in this entire house. The realization settled deep, a cold certainty that she had become a stranger to her own husband and a guest in a place she had once called sanctuary. Alisha pushed away from the wood, her resolve hardening with every step she took back toward the kitchen. The fear was still there, a tight knot in her stomach, but she chose to stop feeding it with uncertainty. She would not sleep, not tonight. She walked to the kitchen island and swept the remnants of the evening meal into the sink with a sharp, rhythmic motion. She grabbed a heavy glass water bottle, its weight grounding her, and placed it within reach. She checked the window latches, pressing her thumbs against the glass until the frames groaned in protest. Everything had to be secure. She pulled a wooden stool into the darkest corner of the room, positioning it so she could see the hallway entrance without being easily spotted. She folded her arms, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her own elbows. The house groaned, settling into the midnight hours. But she did not blink. She listened to the hum of the walls, the snap of cooling pipes, and the distant settling of the foundation. Her pulse remained steady. She was no longer waiting for the house to reveal its secrets. She was going to hunt them down. She focused her eyes on the sliver of darkness where the hallway began, waiting for the first sign of movement. Alisha pressed her spine against the corner of the pantry, her legs drawn tight to her chest. She held a small metal flashlight in her right hand, her thumb resting on the power switch. She did not click it on. To reveal her position was to lose her only advantage. The kitchen was a tomb of shadows, the only light coming from the faint, sickly glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. She watched the hallway. A minute passed, then 5. The house began to wake. It started with a low, vibrating groan deep within the floorboards, as if the foundation were breathing. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles sharp and pale. Every shadow against the wall seemed to stretch, elongated fingers reaching toward her position. A rhythmic creak pulsed through the ceiling, steady and deliberate, like a heavy footfall pacing a slow circle in the room above. She held her breath, listening to the house settle. It was a series of snaps, pops, and wood strains that usually signaled a cooling structure, but tonight, the sounds carried a rhythm she could not explain. She stared into the dark throat of the hallway, waiting for the silence to break. The wall clock in the kitchen became the only heartbeat in the house. Tick. A second passed. Tick. Another. Alisha counted them, her rhythm syncing with the mechanical grind of the gears. She kept her eyes fixed on the hallway, but the shadows refused to resolve into anything solid. Every minute that stretched toward midnight felt like a tightening wire. She shifted her weight, the wooden floor beneath her stool groaning in response, and she froze, terrified that the house had heard her. The rhythmic creaking she had tracked earlier suddenly vanished. The silence that followed was not empty, it was pressurized, heavy, and thick. She swallowed hard, the sound loud as a gunshot in the stagnant air. Her senses were pushed to the absolute limit. She could hear the faint, erratic thrum of blood in her own ears. The clock ticked, each strike echoing with a metallic bite, marking the countdown to something she could no longer avoid. She gripped the flashlight so hard her fingertips burned, waiting for the shadows to move of their own accord. The air grew colder, and the scent of ozone and dust filled the kitchen. She leaned forward, muscles coiled, prepared for the dark to finally reveal its hidden weight. A sliver of moonlight finally pierced the blinds, cutting a pale, jagged path across the hallway floor. Alisha watched the light pool on the hardwood, its brightness highlighting the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. She held her position, her eyes wide, refusing to blink. Then, the light shifted. A long, thin shadow stretched across the floor, moving against the angle of the moon. It was fluid, dark, and unnatural. Alisha surged forward, her hand tightening around the flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the spot where the shadow had elongated, waiting for a silhouette to emerge from the gloom. She leaned into the open space of the hallway, her breath hitched in her throat. Nothing. The floor was empty. The moonlight remained static, casting its cold glow over the same empty boards. She rubbed her eyes, the grit of exhaustion burning beneath her lids, and looked again. Still nothing. The darkness had swallowed the motion, leaving only the oppressive weight of the house behind. She remained crouched, muscles aching, wondering if the house was playing tricks on her mind or if something had truly crossed the threshold. The silence returned, deeper and more hollow than before. Alisha backed away from the hallway, her boots silent on the floorboards. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small handheld monitor. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, sickly green glow against her face. She pressed the button to cycle the feed. Maya was there, huddled under the blankets, her breathing steady and slow. Alisha let out a breath she had been holding for an eternity, but then her gaze drifted to the edge of the frame. The space between the bed and the wall appeared distorted, the pixels blurring into a smudge of static. She adjusted the focus, turning the dial until her fingers cramped. The static cleared, but the space remained wrong. It was not just empty. It looked occupied. A depression in the mattress near the pillow stood out, as if a heavy weight were pressing down on the fabric. Alisha leaned closer, her nose inches from the screen. The grainy image seemed to pulse. The air in the room grew thin. She watched the monitor, paralyzed by the sight of that vacant spot, which felt more menacing than any shadow in the hall. She knew, with a sudden, cold clarity, that the danger was not waiting for her, it was already inside the room. The clock on the wall ticked with a rhythmic, maddening persistence. Alisha sat on the edge of the sofa, her limbs heavy as lead. Every time she closed her eyes, the edges of her vision blurred, painting shapes into the corners of the room that vanished the moment she looked directly at them. Her mind began to fray at the seams. Was Min-jun right? Was this merely the product of a fractured mind, struggling to adapt to a new country? She leaned her head back, watching the ceiling fan slice through the stagnant air. The exhaustion felt like a physical weight, pressing against her temples and distorting the sounds of the house into whispers that weren't there. She exhaled, her pulse slowing to a sluggish crawl. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the rough, jagged surface of the wooden carving. The sharp edges bit into her palm, a sudden, stinging reminder that cut through her fog. It was cold, dense, and undeniably real. The weight of the object grounded her, pulling her back from the brink of doubt. She sat upright, the wood pressing firmly against her skin. The house was not playing tricks. The carving was there, a solid piece of evidence that the threat remained, waiting in the stillness of the dark. The kitchen clock struck 2. The sound was thin and metallic, vibrating through the silence. Alisha remained motionless in the corner, but the atmosphere shifted instantly. A draft, sharp and biting as a winter gale, swept through the room despite the sealed windows. She pulled her arms tight against her chest, her breath blooming in the air as a faint gray mist. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the liquid in her water glass began to cloud with ice. She didn't move. She couldn't. The air around her grew thick, heavy with the scent of stagnant earth and damp, rotted timber. It was not a natural chill. It felt intentional, like a presence pressing its weight into the room. She watched the overhead bulb flicker, the filament humming a low, frantic frequency until it dimmed to a dying amber glow. The light failed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white, feeling the stone turn cold beneath her palms. Something ancient was here, standing in the dark, watching her. It was not waiting in the shadows anymore. It had arrived to claim the space. The minutes dragged, each second stretching into an eternity of anticipation. Alisha crouched in the corner, her fingers locked around the flashlight, casing so tightly that the metal began to dig into her skin. She held her breath, trying to dampen the sound of her own respiration to better hear the house. The silence was absolute. It was no longer an absence of noise, but a heavy, pulsating pressure that filled the kitchen. Her own heartbeat thundered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drum that seemed too loud for the stillness. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to spring, yet she remained perfectly still. She tracked the glow of her wristwatch, the digits shifting with agonizing slowness toward the 3. The air remained stagnant, devoid of even the smallest stir of dust. She pressed her back harder against the wall, seeking support, feeling the rough plaster bite into her shoulders. Her eyes darted across the dark doorway, scanning for the slightest shift in the gloom. The house waited. She waited. The proximity of the hour felt like a physical weight resting on her chest, bracing her for the moment the silence would finally break. The clock finally clicked, marking the threshold of 3. Alisha remained a statue in the corner, her thumb hovering over the flashlight switch. For a long second, nothing happened. The house held its breath alongside her. Then, it began. A floorboard in the hallway groaned, not a settling of old wood, but the distinct, rhythmic pressure of a heavy footfall. She felt the vibration travel through the floor and into her boots, a sharp, jarring impact that echoed in the marrow of her bones. A second, slower creak followed, deliberate and agonizingly steady. It was the sound of someone walking with purpose, moving with a weight that defied the emptiness of the corridor. Alicia's breath hitched, snagging in her throat like jagged glass. She forced her lungs to stay still, refusing to let even the smallest gasp escape. The sound continued, steady and unhurried, drawing closer to the kitchen threshold. Each creak was a hammer blow against her resolve. She pressed her palms against the wall, the plaster rough and cold, and felt the pulse in her fingertips thrumming in sync with the approaching footsteps. The silence was shattered, replaced by the terrifying certainty that she was no longer alone in the dark. The hallway remained a throat of absolute blackness, but the movement changed the geometry of the dark. A portion of the wall, deeper and more dense than the surrounding gloom, began to pull away. It did not step, it drifted. The shadow detached itself from the plaster, a slick, elongated shape that seemed to absorb the dim ambient light rather than reflect it. Alicia's eyes widened, her vision straining to define the edges of the form, but they remained blurred, shifting like ink in water. The silhouette moved with an unnatural gliding gait, sliding across the floorboards without the sound of a footfall. It possessed a terrifying purpose, a trajectory aimed directly at her position. She remained frozen, her entire body locked in a rigid, involuntary defiance. Every nerve ending burned with the primal need to flee, yet her muscles refused to obey. The shadow grew larger, its presence filling the hallway with a sudden, localized drop in temperature that made the air feel brittle. She watched, motionless, as the entity navigated the turn toward the kitchen. It was no longer just a sound in the dark. It was a physical presence, encroaching upon her space with a slow, deliberate hunger that stripped away any remaining doubt. The figure crossed the threshold and stepped into the thin sliver of light spilling from the hallway. Alicia's hands tightened around the flashlight, her knuckles turning white. It was Min-jun. But the man who stood there was not the one who had left for work that morning. He moved with a rhythmic, mechanical gait, his knees lifting too high and his feet striking the floor with a flat, heavy repetition. His arms hung loose at his sides, swinging in perfect synchronization with his steps, lacking the natural tension of a person walking. Most unsettling were his eyes. They were wide, fixed on a point somewhere behind Alicia's shoulder, glazed over with a glassy, unseeing sheen. He did not blink. He did not acknowledge the light. He drifted forward as if guided by an invisible tether, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, rapid cadence that matched the tapping of his heels against the wood. Every muscle in his face was slack, drained of expression, as though his mind had been vacated to make room for something else. He did not deviate from his path, nor did he slow his pace when he reached the center of the kitchen. He simply continued to march, trapped in a trance that rendered him entirely unreachable. Min-jun stopped. The rhythmic tapping of his heels ceased instantly, leaving the kitchen in a hollow, suffocating silence. His shoulders, previously squared and rigid, slumped forward as if the air in the room had suddenly gained weight. He tilted his head at an unnatural angle, his ear turned toward the empty corner by the pantry. Then, he spoke. It was not his usual voice. It was a thin, reedy rasp, fractured and desperate. He began to whisper, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic, pleading cadence. He bowed his neck, pressing his chin into his chest, his hands fluttering at his sides like trapped birds. Every syllable was laden with a sickening, servile tone. He begged, his voice rising and falling in rhythm with his rapid, shallow breaths. He apologized to the void, his eyes darting toward the ceiling, and then back to the shadows beneath the cabinets. There was no arrogance left in his stance. He was a man reduced to a supplicant. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if he were trying to appease an unseen presence that loomed inches away. He paused, his lips moving soundlessly for a heartbeat, and then he whispered again, his voice cracking under the pressure of a hidden, terrifying command. Min-jun fell silent, his body rigid as stone. He held his breath, eyes fixed on the dark corner where the pantry met the wall. The kitchen temperature plummeted, the air thickening with a sudden metallic chill that pricked at Alicia's exposed skin. For 3 agonizing heartbeats, the silence was absolute. Then, it happened. A sound emerged from the darkness, not a whisper, but a vibration that seemed to originate from the floorboards themselves. It was low, gravelly, and distinctly masculine, a rough, wet rasp that carried the weight of something long buried. The voice did not speak words. It emitted a slow, modulated hum that resonated in the hollow of Alicia's chest. A wave of pure, unadulterated horror surged through her, locking her joints and turning her blood to ice. Her skin crawled. The hair on her arms stood upright. She felt a phantom pressure against her ribs, as if the air in the room were being displaced by a physical presence that had no business being there. The gravelly sound deepened, transitioning into a rhythmic, guttural clicking. It was a cold, intelligent noise. Alicia's heart hammered against her sternum, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. She was no longer watching a man talk to himself. She was witnessing a conversation with the impossible. The light switch was too far away, but the flashlight in her grip felt like a heavy, cold weight. Alicia's thumb trembled against the metal button. She had to know. She had to see. With a sharp, sudden click, the beam erupted, a harsh cylinder of white light cutting through the gloom. It hit the corner first. Nothing. Just peeling wallpaper and dust motes dancing in the sudden glare. She swung the beam frantically to the right, sweeping it across the pantry door and the floorboards. Empty. Then, the light caught him. Min-jun stood 5 feet away, his back hunched, his hands clawing at the air, as if gripping a phantom throat. He froze. The beam struck his face, illuminating wide, dilated pupils, and a mouth twisted into a silent, jagged snarl. He looked like a cornered animal, caught in the headlights of an oncoming train, his body coiled to strike or to flee. He did not blink. He did not look at her. His eyes remained locked on the empty space, where the voice had just growled. The light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the tiles. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, his shoulders collapsing as the reality of her presence finally registered. He was trapped in the glare, exposed, yet he still reached out toward the void, his fingers trembling in the empty, freezing air. Alisha kept the beam steady, though her hand shook so violently the light danced across Min-jun's pale skin. He remained motionless, his gaze still fixed on the air beside him. She tried to swallow, but her throat was sandpaper dry. Her eyes flickered away from her husband, compelled by a sickening dread to look at the table. It was there. The heavy mahogany chair had been dragged several inches across the tiled floor. It sat angled outward, as if someone had just stood up from a meal. A single, dark indentation remained in the seat cushion where weight had recently rested. She stared at the empty space, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. There was no one there, yet the chair screamed of a guest who had been waiting. The floorboards beneath the chair were scratched, fresh gouges marking the wood where the legs had scraped during the movement. A cold, metallic scent filled the kitchen, sharper now, like old coins and damp earth. Every instinct in her body ignited. The reality of the unseen visitor crystallized in the silence. Alicia's lungs seized. The scream tore from her throat, a raw, jagged sound that shattered the stillness of the house. It echoed off the walls, a desperate, high-pitched plea that filled the room, yet the empty chair did not budge. The final echo of her scream died against the kitchen cabinets. Alisha stood, chest heaving, her knuckles white as she gripped the flashlight. Min-jun had not moved. He stood like a statue, his focus still anchored to the empty air. The silence was heavier than before, thick enough to choke on. Alisha took one step forward, the soles of her feet sticking to the cold tile. Her voice came out as a broken rasp, barely recognizable to her own ears. "Who are you talking to?" She took another step, closing the gap until she was within arm's reach of him. Her whole body shook, a rhythmic, violent tremor, but she did not drop the light. She jabbed the beam toward his chest, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. "Look at me, Min-jun. Answer me." She was no longer just afraid, she was furious. The betrayal of his secrets felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She stepped closer still, invading his space, her eyes scanning his face for a flicker of recognition. He remained fixed, his eyes glassy, staring through her as if she were made of smoke. She reached out, fingers hovering near his arm, ready to shake him back to reality. "I am not going to ask again," she whispered, her voice trembling with the raw, jagged edge of a woman pushed to the absolute brink of sanity. Min-jun turned his head slowly. The movement was mechanical, devoid of human warmth. His eyes, usually guarded and sharp, were now wide and glassy, reflecting the flashlight beam like polished stones. He did not blink. The air in the kitchen dropped in temperature, a sudden, biting chill that raised gooseflesh on Alicia's arms. "You do not understand, Alisha," he said, his voice stripped of all inflection. It was a flat, hollow sound, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "I told you not to ask. Some questions have consequences." He took a step toward her, forcing her to retreat until her back hit the cold surface of the refrigerator. "My brother died in this house years ago," he continued, his tone devoid of grief or regret. "He never left. The walls, the floors, the air, they belonged to him." The words struck her harder than a physical blow. The reality of his confession tore through her defenses, leaving her breathless and stunned. She felt the floor tilt beneath her, the house itself seeming to compress around them. There was no metaphor, no madness. He spoke of the impossible, as if it were a simple, immutable fact of their existence. The kitchen light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to dance in anticipation of his next words. Min-jun did not look at her. He shifted his gaze toward the dark hallway, his head tilting, as if listening to a whisper only he could hear. "He has been waiting a long time," Min-jun murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "And now, he has chosen." Alisha felt a spike of adrenaline pierce through her numbness. "Chosen who?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Min-jun turned back to her, his smile thin and devoid of life. "Maya. He wants her. He has claimed her as his own." The words hit her like a physical impact, shattering the last remnants of her hesitation. The survival instinct that had kept her moving across borders and oceans surged, cold and absolute. Her pulse hammered against her throat, but her hands stopped shaking. She saw the room differently now, not as a home, but as a trap closing in. She moved to the side, shifting her weight to keep the distance between them. Her eyes darted to the doorway. measuring the path to the bedroom where her daughter slept. The air grew heavy, almost gelatinous, resisting her movement, but she forced herself to breathe. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was a hunt. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles aching, and braced her feet against the floorboards, ready to bolt. Alisha did not look back. She sprinted from the kitchen, her feet slapping hard against the hardwood. The hallway felt abnormally long, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were trying to steer her away from the bedroom door. She shoved her shoulder against the frame, stumbling into the room. Maya was curled in her bed, breathing in slow, rhythmic pulses. Alisha reached the side of the bed in 2 strides, her hands trembling as she shook the child's shoulder. "Maya, get up now!" she hissed, her voice sharp with urgency. Maya blinked, her eyes hazy with sleep, confusion slowing her movements. "Mommy?" she whispered. Alisha did not answer. She hauled her daughter upright, ignoring the child's heavy, lethargic limbs, and pulled her toward the floor. She gripped Maya's hand so tightly, her own knuckles turned white. The child stumbled, catching her balance against the wall, but Alisha kept moving, dragging her toward the door. She shoved the bedroom door open and plunged back into the dark hallway, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every muscle in her body was coiled to run, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. She did not stop to explain, did not stop to look behind her. She moved with the frantic, singular focus of a predator protecting its young, pulling her daughter toward the exit. Alisha hit the foyer, her momentum carrying them toward the front door. She released Maya's hand for a split second to grab the metal handle, her fingers curling around the cold steel. She twisted. It did not move. It felt as if the bolt had been welded into the frame from the outside. She slammed her shoulder into the wood, the impact vibrating through her entire frame, but the door remained immovable. "Mommy?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling in the sudden silence of the entryway. Alisha ignored the question, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She clawed at the deadbolt with her fingernails, the skin tearing. But the mechanism stayed locked. She reached for the chain, but it hung loose and useless, not even engaging the track. She dropped to her knees, looking at the threshold, and saw no light bleeding through the gap under the door. The house was sealed. She stood up again, her lungs burning, and tried the handle once more, shaking the door with every ounce of her remaining strength. It did not rattle. It did not creak. It was as solid as the walls themselves. They were not just inside, they were imprisoned. The sanctuary had become a cage, and the locks were held by someone or something that had no intention of letting them leave. Alisha spun around, her back hitting the cold wood of the door. The hallway was dim, but Min-jun stood in the center, perfectly still. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at Maya. His eyes were fixed on the empty air hovering just behind Alisha's shoulder. She watched, frozen, as his spine bent forward in a slow, calculated arch. It was a formal, deep bow, the kind reserved for a master. He held the position, his neck exposed, his arms hanging limp at his sides. There was no one in the space he greeted. No shadow, no figure, just the stale, heavy air of the hallway. Alisha gripped Maya's hand, pulling the child behind her, but Min-jun did not blink. He remained bowed, his face turned toward the void with a terrifying, hollow devotion. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge their presence at all. He was entirely disconnected from the reality of their escape. The man she had known, the man who had brought them to this city, was gone. In his place stood something else, a servant waiting for a command from a master that only he could see. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as he stayed locked in that subservient posture, acknowledging a presence that filled the room with a cold, absolute weight. Alisha looked at the walls. They seemed to pulse, the wallpaper peeling back like dead skin. The hallway had narrowed since she first walked through it. Each breath she took felt heavier, the air thick with the scent of stagnant, trapped dust. She pressed her palms against the plaster and felt a low, rhythmic vibration beneath the surface, a heartbeat that did not belong to the house. It was a machine designed to hold something in, but now it was holding them in. They were not tenants, they were bait. The ceiling lowered, the corners of the room blurring into a singular, suffocating darkness. Min-jun remained bowed, his presence now just another fixture in the architecture. a living lock on the door. Alisha looked at the floorboards, seeing them buckle and rise, sealing the edges of the room tight. There was no way through the walls. The house was not a structure of wood and stone. It was a hungry, deliberate space built to sustain a presence that had never left. Every inch of the interior pressed inward, pinning them against the center of the hall, ensuring there was nowhere left to retreat. The trap was complete. The house had finally closed its jaws. Alisha scanned the room, her eyes darting past the bowed figure of her husband. The walls were drawing closer, but a sliver of darkness remained against the far wall, the back window. It was small, set high above the floor, but it was the only break in the suffocating geometry of the house. She grabbed a heavy, discarded metal lamp from the side table. The metal felt cold and dense in her grip. She shoved Maya toward the corner, her movements sharp and frantic. She did not look at Min-jun. She focused entirely on the pane of glass. She swung the lamp with every ounce of her strength. The impact was violent. The sound of breaking glass erupted through the apartment like a gunshot, slicing through the heavy, stagnant air. Shards sprayed outward into the night, glittering as they caught the moonlight. The sudden rush of cold, unfiltered wind hit her face, smelling of damp earth and freedom. She hooked her fingers into the jagged frame, pulling down on the remaining glass to clear the jagged teeth of the window. The barrier was gone. A gap opened, wide enough to climb through. She turned back to the room, ready to pull Maya toward the only path left to them. Alisha gripped Maya under the arms and hoisted her toward the jagged opening. The child scrambled, her palms pressing against the rough stone of the exterior wall. Alisha pushed, her own feet slipping on the slick, vibrating floorboards as the house groaned around them. The structure seemed to fight their exit, the frame pinching at Maya's side, but Alisha shoved harder, forcing the girl through the gap. Once Maya was clear, Alisha grabbed the windowsill, her knuckles white, and hauled herself upward. Sharp fragments of glass bit into her skin, but she did not stop. She scrambled over the edge, feeling the house shudder as if the foundation itself were collapsing inward. She didn't look back at the room, the abandoned furniture, or the life they had built in the suffocating silence. She threw her weight forward, tumbling out of the frame and into the night air. They landed hard on the damp earth below, limbs tangling, breath hitching in the sudden, vast silence of the street. She scrambled to her feet, pulling Maya upright, and began to run. The heavy, pressurized air of the apartment was gone, replaced by the cool, sharp bite of the wind. They did not slow down. They left the house behind, a dark, silent box sinking back into the shadows of the city. They sprinted toward the end of the narrow alley, boots slapping hard against the wet pavement. Each step took them further from the house, yet the silence of the night felt thin, fragile. Just as Alisha rounded the corner, a sound cut through the air behind them. It was a voice, Min-jun's voice, but stripped of the calm, detached tone he had used only moments before. He was shouting from inside the house, his words carrying clearly through the open, shattered window. He was repeating a name Alisha had never heard, a name that held no place in their lives. The syllables hung in the cold air, rhythmic and haunting, as if he were reciting a prayer to an empty room. Alisha's heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped Maya's hand so tightly the girl stumbled, but she did not let go. She did not look back. The voice grew louder, more insistent, blending with the low groan of the settling structure. She pushed Maya faster, her lungs burning with the intake of sharp midnight air. The name echoed again, desperate and hollow, a final anchor trying to pull them back into the dark. She ignored it. She forced her legs to move, driving them into the safety of the city shadows, leaving the ghost caller to his empty, echoing house. The residential streets gave way to the main thoroughfare, and the world suddenly exploded into artificial color. Neon signs flickered in shades of electric blue and harsh magenta, reflecting off the damp asphalt like spilled paint. Alisha did not stop. She kept her pace rhythmic, forced, a machine driven by the singular need to create distance. The city was alive with movement, distant sirens, the hum of late-night transit, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a million lives, moving in sync. It was a stark, cold contrast to the stagnant, heavy air of the house. Maya kept pace, her breath ragged, but she did not cry. She simply gripped Alicia's hand, her fingers locked tight. Alisha felt the heat of the city lights against her skin, a sharp departure from the chilling draft that had haunted their living room. Every passing vehicle, every pedestrian walking toward them, felt like a barrier she had to navigate, yet she never slowed. She scanned the horizon for a landmark, a sign, anything that signaled the end of the nightmare. There was no looking back. The house and the voice were dissolving into the background static of the urban night, replaced by the relentless, indifferent energy of the metropolis. They reached a subway entrance, the light spilling upward from the ground, and descended into the noise, finally blending into the crowd. The subway platform was crowded, a blur of motion and sound that shielded them from the quiet of the night. Alisha stood against a concrete pillar, her chest heaving as she tried to regulate her breathing. The air here was metallic, smelling of ozone and dust, far removed from the stagnant cold of their former home. She looked down at Maya. The child was quiet, staring at the tracks with a blank intensity that sent a fresh jolt of clarity through Alisha. The house was gone. The locked doors and the whispering shadows were now miles away, yet the sensation of being watched remained etched into her skin. She understood then that the move had not been escape from a place, but an attempt to outrun a history that lived in the architecture itself. Some secrets were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be abandoned. The walls of that house held a cycle that did not belong to them. Her journey for peace had stripped away her illusions, leaving behind a hard, sharp edge of survival. She did not need to know what name Min-jun had been calling. She only needed to know that she was the one who had finally walked away. The train roared into the station, a wall of steel and light, and she stepped forward, leaving the memory of the house to be buried in the silence they left behind. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the unfamiliar room. Alisha sat by the window, watching the city wake up. The street noise was different here. Rhythmic, distant, lacking the suffocating weight of the house they had abandoned. She pressed a hand against the cold glass, feeling the vibration of the morning traffic. Maya was asleep nearby, her breathing steady and deep, a sound that finally grounded Alisha in the present. Yet, whenever the wind rattled the window pane, Alisha flinched. The habit of listening for the deadbolt, for the creak of floorboards, for the gravelly cadence of a voice that should not exist, it remained. These were the ghosts that traveled, the ones that did not stay buried in the walls but settled into the marrow. She looked at her own hands, steady now but stained by the weight of what she had witnessed. There was no going back to the person she had been before the move. That version of her had stayed behind, locked in a room with a man who spoke to empty air. She turned away from the window and walked to the door, checking the lock once, twice, and then stopping. She would never truly feel the walls were just walls again, but she was alive. She reached out, turned off the light, and stepped out into the day, leaving the shadow of the house to fade into the past. For more stories, kindly subscribe. Be the first to get it.